So the United Nations International Court of Justice in The Hague recognized its jurisdiction in the case of Ukraine versus Russia. The Russian Federation had raised 5 preliminary objections and all 5 were overruled, with the court saying its judgment is final and cannot be appealed. So this was a huge decision, huge victory for Ukraine in the International Court against Russia. But can you tell us how significant is it?
Indeed, it was a milestone in international litigation of Ukraine against Russian Federation in terms of this case and other ongoing cases, especially in terms of European Court of Human Rights, International Criminal Court. The outcome of this decision, which was delivered last Friday, is that Ukraine has broke through the jurisdictional phase. This is not the first time actually the court looked into the issue of jurisdiction, namely back in 2017 when Ukraine instituted proceedings against Russian Federation. It also requested for indicating provisional measures for the court in order to substantiate its claims with regard to Russian Federation, and approximately in half a year court delivered such a decision, and it recognized prima facie jurisdiction, that is preliminary jurisdiction, and leaving the other side of jurisdiction for the next stage, which took place recently. And in this very case the court addressed the issue of material jurisdiction. That is why he evaluated how the claims of Ukraine if were or were not within the scope of 2 conventions. Let me remind you that these were 2 conventions which enabled Ukraine to trigger its litigation against Russian Federation, since in international law there is no a single court to deliver the decision and to find a proper solution to all the issues. These were the first ones, the Convention on the elimination of all the forms of racial discrimination, and the other is on suspension of financing terrorism.
And there was a slight fear that perhaps the one on financing terrorism wasn't going to be in the jurisdiction of this court. Is that right?
This was actually one of the caveats which was expressed in the within the experts actually before the decision was delivered as such, namely that up to this date the court didn't have the proper any single case actually in terms of convention on suppression of financing terrorism. This was the first point, and the other point, that terrorism as such is a very sensitive issue, often is a mixture of political and other issues, and that's why it was like a large victory for Ukraine in oral when we had like a decision which was successful for Ukraine. And
tell me, what happens next now that the court has said it does have jurisdiction in this case?
So on the next stage of this very litigation, the court will look directly into the merits of the case, namely the issues which were raised by Ukraine in terms of the aforementioned conventions. For example, when it refers to the Convention of the Eradication of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, this was the very convention invoked by Ukraine in terms of the situation in Crimea, and that is Ukraine alleges that there is an ongoing systematic policy of oppression of Ukrainian citizens as well as Crimean Tatars, which are dissent with the policy of Russian Federation and its annexation of Crimea, and which is emanating from the harassment and intimidation of these very people. And Ukraine gives proper examples of abductions, killings, and torture. Rishata matter, for example, this was one of the first cases. The other thing which could be invoked is the usage of anti-extremist legislation in order to persecute.
Which they have done.
in order to persecute these people, and also retroactive application of criminal code of Russian Federation for the events, for example, of 26th of February 2014, the demonstration in support of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and a lot of alike instances which prove the fact that this is the pattern of behavior which is very purposeful in order to intimidate all these people which are not which are dissenting with the policy of Russian Federation. In contrast, the other convention on suppression of financing terrorism, it is upheld by Ukraine's allegations of using heavy weapons in order to shell civilians and civilian objects, and among these instances Ukraine has picked some of the most severe ones. Of course, not all of them. This is the shelling of Avdiivka, Mariupol, Volnovakha, Kramatorsk, and also down in MH17 Malaysian Airlines, and also some of the examples which prove some bombing in the cities which are not very close to the contact line with LNR and DNR. These unlawful entities, and they are recalling some instances of Kharkiv, so-called Kharkiv partisans, which are affiliated to Russian Federation, who was financing supposedly them. On the general scale, Ukraine asserts that Russian Federation used its territory in order to finance and to provide funds to the entities and its proxies, which were engaging, which were waging war against Ukraine through providing funds, through providing weapons, and through exerting control over the border with so-called LNR, DNR.
Yeah. So really, this particular case involves every part of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. It's not really limited to one particular instance, such as the MH17 tragedy or human rights in Crimea. We have a quote from the Deputy Foreign Minister, Olana Zokol, who spoke in The Hague after the hearing, so we can have a listen.
По Боїнгу це дуже важливе рішення, тому що насправді
Regarding the Boeing, it was an extremely important decision because, in fact, it means that Russia will be brought to justice and that it will be obliged to try to justify its actions in the international court for bringing weapons to Ukraine and for everything that followed. That the court and the international community will see what transpired. They will have access to all the files. Moreover, this may influence the matter regarding the creation of a tribunal in the frameworks of the UN Security Council. I'm very grateful to all of you. Today we had a truly great victory.